For this part of the program, we have a very special guest. This is the moment that we have been waiting for. We are honored, truly blessed to have Dr. Cornel West, one of America's foremost intellectuals, with us this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cornel West. Brother Cornel West, welcome. To give a little background, not that he needs an introduction, Dr. Cornel West is the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Chair at Union Theological Seminary. Dr. West teaches on the works of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as well as on courses in philosophy of religion, African-American critical thought, and a wide range of subjects, including, but by no means limited to, the classics, philosophy, cultural theory, literature, and music. Dr. West is the former professor of the practice of public philosophy at Harvard University and professor emeritus at Princeton University. Cornel West graduated magna cum laude from Harvard in 3 years and obtained his MA and PhD in philosophy at Princeton University. He has written over 20 books and has edited 13. He is best known for his classics, Race Matters and Democracy Matters, and for his memoir, Brother West, Living and Loving Out Loud. His most recent book, Black Prophetic Fire, offers an unflinching look at 19th and 20th century African-American leaders and their visionary legacies. Dr. West is a frequent guest on The Bill Maher Show, CNN, C-SPAN, and Democracy Now! He has a passion to communicate to a vast variety of publics in order to keep alive in the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., a legacy of telling the truth and bearing witness to love and justice. Welcome, Dr. West.
I am so very blessed to be here, my dear sister Nimco, or Professor Nimco, I want to say, absolutely. But I do want to salute Brother Imran, who's already doing a wonderful job coming up from Arizona. And of course, Sister Amanda making that move as well. So Seattle CAIR will be stronger than ever. And I must say, the two younger sisters, both Miriams, superb, superb, superb. So CAIR is in good hands and in good shape in Jimi Hendrix Town, Seattle. Indeed. And I want to salute the brother who received the award too from Tacoma, another doctor. It's just a blessing to be on the same platform as him. And I hope and pray that he and his family are stronger than ever.
Thank you, Dr. West. To get us started, Dr. West, we've seen unprecedented levels of protest in the past few years, standing up against police violence targeting the Black community. Muslim solidarity with Black liberation has been strong, and it has been championed especially by Black Muslims whose vision and leadership are just as foundational to Muslim communities as they are to Black communities. Our struggles for justice are interlinked. In places like Seattle, there have been real pushes to reform our policing systems and to bring forth some redress to the victims of state violence throughout the years. Yet still, we are facing unprecedented levels of systemic racism rearing its head in our society, with assaults on voting rights, as well as an unwillingness to discuss racism. For our audience here, could you talk about the importance of being essential partners in building a just future and standing up against the ongoing proliferation of systemic anti-Blackness, anti-Muslim, and anti-immigrant bigotry and xenophobia?
I appreciate that question. Many dimensions, many facets, many aspects in that question. I want to begin with this fundamental commitment I think we all must have to solidarity with each other. And by solidarity, what I mean is based on a love, is based on a justice, is based on a deep care and a consideration of the humanity of each and every one of us, especially those who are hated, terrorized, and traumatized. That when I think of my own relation to the rich tradition of Islam, that as a Christian, I recognize I come from a people, a great people, a Black people in the midst of the American empire, who after being hated chronically for 400 years, keep dishing out love warriors. After being traumatized systemically, we keep dishing out wounded healers. And after being terrorized, we keep dishing out freedom fighters. Now, you think the greatest freedom fighter that we produced in the Black community was a Muslim. His name was Malcom X. So that Islam is integral to the very experience of my own community, my own tradition, my own people. Our greatest athlete, Muhammad Ali, integral. The greatest hip hop artist, Rakim. I know people want to debate Rakim, Tupac, so forth and so on. I go with Tupac, Muslim brother to the car. And then John Coltrane would not exist without Naima, his wife, who was a strong, independent Muslim woman. She was the one who loved him enough to put pressure with him enough to stay committed to his vocation of blowing that saxophone and producing that Love Supreme and Giant Steps and Side Steps and all the other music that helps heal us. So that when we actually think of solidarity, it's not a matter of having to get up and go on the other side of town only. It's something that is constitutive of our own lives and our own communities, but then the moral dimension and the spiritual dimensions of caring for each other, respecting each other. You see, that's the connection I have to Imran and Amanda and yourself, Nimco and others. You see, that no matter what the situation is, when you're hated, you're traumatized, you're terrorized, you're not being treated right, you've got to be there with each other. Be it marching on the street, going to jail, raising our voices, being in dialogue with each other. We may not agree on everything philosophically, theologically, ideologically, at the moral and spiritual level. We're against idolatry. That's part of the three great historic religions. One could argue Judaism and Christianity and Islam. Against idolatry, against fetishes, keeping a focus on a God that is not only alive in our lives, but is connected to love, justice, mercy.
Thank you, Dr. West. That's so important. Recently, we've seen a major uptick in incidents targeting masjids, mosques here in Washington state and all throughout the United States, including multiple arsons. It's hard for the average person to wrap their heads around how these upticks in anti-Muslim bigotry manifest themselves, with many believing that this is merely a recent phenomenon or the result of Trumpism. But the reality is in this 21st century global war on terror, it has exported, the global war on terror has exported Islamophobia and provided a template for others to deploy this same rhetoric to oppress Muslim minorities, as is the case of Muslims in India, Kashmir, Uyghurs, and Rohingya. Can you talk a little bit about how Islamophobia is exported on a global scale?
Yeah, you know, this ugly hatred of precious Muslim brothers and sisters has a long history. It's a very long history. It goes all the way back to the 15th century, where the Muslims were characterized as a degraded other by Christian civilization. As we move into the 20th century, and it comes to the context of the American empire, you know, between 1945 and 1991, the major foes of the American empire in the eyes of the elites, in the eyes of those who rule, were communists and Black activists. With the collapse of the Soviet Empire in 1991, it shifted to Muslims, Muslims associated with terrorism, Muslims associated with various forms of opposition to the American empire around the world and internally, you see. And it's been escalating ever since 2001, of course. And then it takes on a whole different set of dimensions, and it continues. So that you have, on the one hand, you've got the anti-Blackness, which is one of the foundations of the empire itself, with enslaved African peoples. And I know, coming from Somalia, the great country in Africa, that you're part of that great tradition of engaging in critique and resistance. But it was also of progressives. So you had some progressive white folk, you had a whole host of progressive others who were trashed. And then the indigenous peoples, it's always their land, their culture, their civilization that was stolen, that was demonized, and the genocidal attack on them. In the last 25 years, the anti-Muslim, the hatred of precious Islamic brothers and sisters intensifies. And it's something that we have to keep a serious focus on. Now, of course, the anti-Jewish hatred is always there as well. It's much more complicated because as Jews, brothers and sisters gain access to positions of power, too often the dominant Jewish elites accommodate themselves to the imperial elites who are running things at the top. And those imperial elites tend to be a whole host of different colors, but disproportionately vanilla. So that we want to have a historical analysis of what is going on, even as we hold on to our moral and our spiritual standards of being in solidarity with whoever is being persecuted, Black, white, Jewish, Catholic, Muslims, Baha'i, whoever they are, because that's the best of the prophetic energies of Islam, the best of the prophetic energies of Christianity, the best of the prophetic energies of Judaism, which is what? To make sure you're spreading that hesed, that loving kindness, that steadfast love to the orphan, the widow, to the fatherless, to the motherless, to the oppressed, to the persecuted. Now, of course, we always have, Jews and Christians and Muslims who will accommodate themselves to imperial power, who will accommodate themselves to the worst of predatory capitalism, who will accommodate themselves to the worst of homophobia, transphobia, or what have you. And we must engage in serious critique of our fellow religious folk, fellow Christians, fellow Jews, fellow Muslims. But when you're talking about an organization like CAIR that says we are open to solidarity with a variety of voices, forces, and institutions in the name of the best of our rich tradition of Islam. You see, that for me is crucial, because that's the kind of solidarity we have to have in the face of all of this hatred and greed and bigotry coming at us.
Thank you, Dr. West. Dr. West, you've protested for divestment from apartheid South Africa, for the rights of workers, for the humanity of any oppressed people, no matter who they are, no matter what color, gender, sexual orientation. You've been a fearless voice for human rights throughout your career, and someone who has spoken out in support for Palestinian freedom and has faced backlash and repercussions for doing so. CAIR has been a leading voice in the United States by challenging laws being passed on the state level to criminalize the right to boycott on behalf of Palestine. Can you speak on why it's so hard to have a robust, respectful conversation about the occupation? And why is the struggle for Palestinian liberation so central to the struggle against settler colonialism globally?
Well, my dear sister, the great Henry James wrote a letter to the less great Robert Louis Stevenson, both powerful writers in a variety of different ways. And part of the letter said, no theory is kind to us that cheats us of seeing. And what he was saying was, any set of lens that cheats us of seeing certain realities is cheating us. And we have been living in a framework when it comes to trying to understand the history of Israel, its founding, the Nakba and the catastrophe, the occupation of Palestinian lands and peoples. We've been living in a framework where it's been very difficult for people to really see rich Palestinian humanity, rich Palestinian dignity, rich Palestinian creativity, and ugly Palestinian suffering, vicious Israeli domination and occupation. So if you have a framework where you can't see it, it's very difficult to have a dialogue with people because they're not seeing things. It's very much like the history of America, not seeing Black humanity, and not seeing Black suffering. So when Martin Luther King Jr. presents himself as a critic of the empire, he's viewed as communist, he's viewed as a hater, and Malcom X the same way, because you have these very narrow frameworks. And so part of what it is to be part of a prophetic tradition in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, or even with our precious secular brothers and sisters, how do you stay in contact with the humanity of people who are rendered invisible, given the frameworks that are in place? So I was blessed to know the great Edward Said. He's one of the greatest public intellectuals of the last 50 years, alongside Noam Chomsky and Stanley Aronowitz and a few others. And what was Edward Said saying? Your framework is too narrow and truncated, and you're cheating folk. He said that he said that to New York Times. He said that to ABC and NBC and the corporate media. He said that to the Academy. You can't stay in contact with the rich humanity of Palestinian peoples, which means you got deep anti-Palestinian blinders, and it's tied to the hatred of Palestinians, the traumatizing of Palestinians, the terrorizing of Palestinians, very much like Black folk in the United States, very much like precious brothers and sisters from the southern tip of Africa to the northern tip, from South Africa to Somalia. That's what it is to be part of a colonized framework. And when you're a settler colony, your assumption is that the settlers have the humanity, and those who are oppressed and dominated and occupied are less than human. And we're simply here to say at CAIR, that's a lie. The lies about our precious Palestinian brothers and sisters must be exposed. The lies about our precious African brothers and sisters must be exposed. The lies about Black brothers and sisters must be on and on and on. Indigenous peoples and so forth. Now people come along and say, oh, well, that sounds like political correctness, and you all just trying to destabilize what's in place. Yes, we are. We're not just trying to destabilize it, we're trying to fundamentally transform it, because the suffering is not only indefensible, but is wrong morally and spiritually and politically. The status quo cannot stand. And we have seen, when I first met Brother Said in 1977, we've seen ways in which the framework has broadened and deepened because the lies have been exposed. The New York Times, so there was disputed territories. We'll never use the word occupy. No, it is an occupation. Tell the truth. Well, they finally started using it. Democratic Party won't use it yet. Many of us put pressure on under Brother Bernie and so forth. Let's write it into the platform. This is an occupation. It is illegal. It is wrong. It is barbaric. No, Democratic Party hasn't moved that far yet. We see. They still locked into that little narrow framework. Same was true with Jim Crow in the 1940s. How you going to talk about you so progressive, FDR? Which he was for whites and others. But for Black folk, no, he wasn't going to break the back of American apartheid, which is what Jim Crow was. He's not going to break the back of Jane Crow, which is American apartheid. No, because he's got Southern elites in his party, and he says he has a compromise. So, too narrow. He's cheating himself. He's cheating the country. He's tied to mendacity. Mendacity hides criminality. The lies told about precious Palestinian brothers and sisters are tied to the crimes against precious Palestinian brothers and sisters. Now, it's true that, we can talk about Muslims in China whose humanity is being debased and so forth by Chinese imperial elites. We have to have a moral and spiritual critique across the board. But to talk just about the Israeli-Palestinian situation, to talk just about Americans' money, 4 billion and now another billion added, and yet hardly anybody can say a mumbling word when precious Palestinians, humans, women, men, and children are killed systemically. They can't say a mumbling word. Obama couldn't say a word. The Black Caucus couldn't say a word. The Progressive Caucus would hardly say a word. Thank God we got some from the squad now who will raise some of these issues. I'm very much for that. But it's a matter of courage. And it's a matter not of self-righteousness, but simply saying, you're cheating yourself, you're cheating your country, you're cheating any democratic prospects if you can't see the humanity, the creativity, the resistance, the resilience, but also the suffering and the social misery. And I mean, thank God that your generation, Sister Nimco, Professor Nimco, your generation has voices, Sisters Miriam and the others, and you got a number of young Jewish brothers and sisters know they've been lied to by their parents and their grandparents in terms of various discourses that don't allow the humanity and suffering of Palestinians to be manifest, various Zionist ideologies that lose sight of the rich humanity of Palestinians. Many of the young Jewish brothers and sisters are waking up, if not now, in other organizations. So again, it's a moral and a spiritual issue. And I wish actually that more Black folk would wake up. I think Black Palestinian solidarity is crucial. It's fundamental. And so when it comes to boycotts and sanctions and calls for disinvestments and so forth, the same response we had to South Africa. This is a non-violent form of resistance to make sure that the rich humanity of Palestinians is never, ever overlooked. It is affirmed, and that they have the same dignity, they have the same right to self-determination as any other peoples on the globe. I wish there were more such Black voices, but the problem is that it's still a taboo issue. You know, it's just people are so intimidated and they're scared to raise their voices. They think they'll be called anti-Semitic. They think they'll be called a hater of Jews when all you're trying to say is a Palestinian baby has exactly the same value as a precious Jewish baby, and a precious Jewish baby has exactly the same value as a precious and priceless Palestinian baby. That's a moral and spiritual commitment. And just to be committed to that puts you over against the narrow frameworks of trying to understand Israeli-Palestinian relations in the United States. And you got powerful interests at the top, very, very powerful interests at the top. And it's hard too, my dear sister, for many people to grasp the fundamental fact that for over 2,000 years, our precious Jewish brothers and sisters have been dehumanized and trashed and devalued. And so they have an underdog mentality, and it's understandable because anti-Jewish violence and hatred has been chronic, especially in Christian civilizations, but also others. But when they're in a situation when they're top dog, tied to the biggest top dog, the American empire in the world, it's hard for them to shift from that underdog mentality of 2,000 years to new circumstances in which you're the one that has nuclear power. You're the one that gets the $4 billion. You're the one that's trying to get, that has the dome. You're the one that's dominating. You're the one that's occupying. And you're so used to understanding yourself as oppressed, dominated, and occupied. Oh, that's a shift. It is a shift. And that's a challenge to us because we can understand how difficult it is for people to understand that shift. And yet the shift is something that has to be grasped, that we know that oppressed people, when they become oppressors, can become just as cruel as the folk who oppress them. It's a human thing. I've seen it in Africa. I've seen it in Latin America. I've seen it in the Middle East. I've seen it in Asia. And so that's why moral and spiritual standards have to be the key. And that's why CAIR is so very important. And that's why the work that you are doing and the others is so significant.
So important. Thank you so much for that, Dr. West. I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned about the youth and the youth, inspiring the youth. I wanted to ask what advice you have for youth that are critically oriented in the audience, who aren't interested in the status quo, who are concerned about issues of justice and about suffering here and around the world. What advice do you have for them? How do you, what should they continue to do to stay motivated?
Yes, you know, I think the greatest public intellectual of the 20th century in the American Empire was W.B. Du Bois. And he actually was agnostic, but he was very spiritual. He was religiously musical because he could tease out the great insights and witnesses of religious traditions, but he remained very secular in many ways, tied to the authority of science, and was agnostic when it came to God. So he and I had disagreements in that regard. But Du Bois raised 4 fundamental questions. And I think these questions are in some ways a kind of love letter to the younger generation. And the love letter had to do with, how do you keep loving truth, condition of truth to allow suffering to speak? How do you keep loving beauty? And there is no beauty without wrestling with terror. How do you love goodness? You can't understand goodness unless you understand its resilience and resistance against evil. And how do you understand the holy? Over against the devilish and the demonic, the indifference and the callousness. Now, his question was, how does integrity face oppression? So when you think of Palestinian resistance against Israeli occupation, you think of landless peasants in Brazil, resistance against greedy property owners. When you think of great freedom fighters fighting against ugly white supremacists, when you think of women fighting against patriarchal elites and so forth, the fundamental question is, how does integrity face that? Intellectual integrity, truth-telling, spiritual integrity, witness bearing, to be a witness. And sometimes that's martyr, because the Greek word has the same meaning, martyr and witness, you see. Sometimes you're willing to live, sometimes you're willing to die, which simply means you're willing to give everything to a great cause bigger than you. If you're a good Muslim, there is no God other than Allah. That's your vocation. It's different than your profession. That's your calling. That's different than just your career. You see? How does integrity face oppression? Intellectual integrity, moral integrity, spiritual integrity. Second question, what does honesty do in the face of deception? You think about empire, imperialist lies. You think about race, white supremacist lies. You think about gender, male supremacist lies. You think about economic systems, whatever ism they are. Sometimes they become the communism, wonderful ideals, ends up producing too much repression. Capitalism, preoccupation with freedom and liberty. No, you're generating domination and occupation and exploitation tied to greed, especially for those at the top. You have to be honest. Honesty has subversive consequences when you follow it all the way through. Because if you shatter the deception, you shatter the lies, and then you got self-deception, the lies you tell about yourself. That's a perennial process of learning how to die in order to learn how to live, to kill the lies inside of you so that you can become a more truthful person, a more honest person. So you got integrity in the face of oppression. You got honesty in the face of deception. The third, decency in the face of insult. When you listen to our brother, Dr. Abdul, sitting in that car, and you saw his response to the vicious attack on the Islamic institution, you could feel integrity, honesty, decency. And that's why people who are Christians and Judaic and secular could be in solidarity with that kind of assault, because it's indecent. And we have to call it so, and then put our voices, bodies, organizations, institutions in solidarity with our dear brother and our Muslim brothers and sisters. He does exactly the same thing when Christian churches are attacked, when Jewish synagogues are attacked, when trade union institutions are attacked, when other institutions that are being, viciously assaulted, here comes that cloud of witnesses saying, in the name of integrity and honesty and decency as filtered through our traditions, we stand in solidarity. Now, the last question is in some ways the most difficult one, my dear sister, that Du Bois raised. What does courage do in the face of brute force? Because you must be able to come to terms with brute force and violence and coercion. Those are the hounds of hell. That hatred, that greed, that hypocrisy have a public face of violence. The violence in Gaza, the violence in the West Bank, the violence under apartheid, the violence at the workplace, the violence women have to come to terms with at home, the violence of the street of our precious gays and lesbians and others. What do you do in the face of that brute force? Courage. You don't give in, you don't cave in, you don't give up. And courage is the enabling virtue for all the other virtues. You can't be a Muslim and be a coward. You can't be a Christian and be a coward. You can't be a member of Judaism and be a coward. Because when they're calling for love and for justice and for decency and for honesty, that means you've got to be willing to cut against the grain. And courage is about what? Taking a risk. Courage is about what? Cutting against the grain, being in but not of the world, in the language of my own Black church. You see, where we were always told, if the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. And what does that mean? That means that when you're leaving heaven behind in a hellish world, you're going to have a lot of enemies. You're going to have to deal with oppression. You're going to have to deal with deception. You're going to have to deal with assaults and attacks. You're going to have to deal with brute force. But if you hold on to integrity, honesty, decency, and courage, and then have solidarity, so that with the CAIR folk in Washington, yes, I'm with my brothers and sisters there. That's exactly right. They're mistreating indigenous peoples in Arizona. I'm with. If you're messing with the poor whites in Appalachia, I'm with you. If you're messing with Jews in Russia, I'm with you. If you're messing with Asians in Chicago, I'm with you. Why? Because like CAIR Washington, like CAIR at the national level, we are a council of human relations about justice, equality, decency, and honesty. We do it in the name of our Islamic tradition because we're Muslims. Yes, how beautiful, how magnificent. All others will do in the name of their Christian tradition. That's what I hold on to. The forces are getting thinner all the time, but we won't go into that right now. You can do it in the name of your secular traditions, but it's that, those are the things that bring us together: the commitment, the integrity, honesty, decency, courage, with the moral and spiritual dimensions as filtered through our own particular traditions.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. Professor West, this concludes our time together. I feel like it went by so quickly. I want to take a moment to thank you so much for joining us today and for imparting your wisdom on us. Thank you for all you do to support CAIR's tradition of excellence, community service, and the relentless pursuit of justice and civil rights for Muslims and for everyone in our country and beyond. Thank you again. It was truly an honor to have this conversation with you, Dr. West.
I was blessed to be in conversation with you. And anytime my dear brother Imran calls, I come running, and similarly so with yourself. And now with the young sisters, Miriam too.
Yes.
And brother Dr. Abdul, absolutely. And Amanda, you all are forces for good.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. West.